We have some suspicions of what it'll be. What we have seen in the last couple of weeks is the president has dramatically shifted his tone toward Vladimir Putin. So whereas he had previously been effusive in his praise of the president and really condemning President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, he's now shifted and essentially said he's run out of patience with Vladimir Putin over the fact that he has refused to stop the bombardment of Ukraine. So it could be a couple of things. One could be sanctions. He's talked favorably about a bill working its way through the Senate right now.
What's left, though?
Well, the bill would go after sales of Russian oil. So they imposed this price cap that allowed Russia to sell some oil. Basically, they wanted to restrict oil but not tank the oil market. So there is the possibility that they would ratchet that up. So that's the big one. The other is the possibility that he'll really open the floodgates on weapons. So he has not sought more money from Congress in his second term to provide more weapons to Ukraine. A possibility that he'll say, we know he's more favorable toward the idea of sending weapons, so he may say we're going to put some money where our mouth is on that.
But is that politically tenuous for the president, given especially during the campaign, there was this idea that, okay, if Democrats win, we're just going to keep sending money and weapons to Ukraine. There was also this wing in the Republican Party that's like, hey, this is not our war to be fighting.
Well, I mean, it's the politics of it aren't really clear, but you have this sanctions bill in the Senate that has like 85 senators on board, so it's real bipartisan support. And there is a very strong wing of the Republican Party that supports a lot more aid to Ukraine. And then you have the fact that, President Trump, he has said openly, I get to define what America first is, so get on board, and we've seen a lot of evidence that a lot of the MAGA supporters have really been supportive of whatever he decides to do, including bombing Iran. So that's a big question. There are several people, though, including J.D. Vance and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who have been much more ambivalent about the idea of the U.S. committing more weaponry to Ukraine. So a lot will depend if he does do that on the dollar figure. If it's, a $60 billion supplemental like Joe Biden signed toward the tail end of his term, that would be a very big signal. If it's anything less than $10 billion, I think you'd see that as sort of a hedge by the president.
Nick, so with North Korea supplying as much as 40% of Russia's ammunition, we know that Russia is providing money and technology to North Korea in exchange for these weapons. What chapter are we in right now in the war? How big of an asset is this for Russia?
Well, it's a huge asset. What they really need is a lifeline. They need continuous weapons. They're spending a lot of their munitions. You've seen this uptick in attacks by Russia against Ukraine, drones, things like that. So they are running low, and they need as much help as they can get. Iran is no longer really part of the procedure, part of the process, because they, obviously everything that's happened in the war with Israel and the strikes by the U.S., they're really sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel with North Korea. The challenge is that there is no end in sight there. The U.S. cannot really put any pressure on North Korea, so it is a fairly consistent and reliable lifeline for Russia that it just would not otherwise get, and it's becoming more and more dependent on.
So, of course, this has been going on for years, this conflict. And as you mentioned, there's not much more that the U.S. can do. It seems as though there's nothing left here. But really, where are we? How would you describe this time period? Who's pushing ahead right now?
Well, it's really a crucial moment because Russia has stepped up these air attacks, and the weapons that Ukraine needs to defend against these drone and missile attacks from Russia are precisely the things that the U.S. has been sort of waffling on. So the big question now is, if you have this gap in supplies to Ukraine, who fills it? Is President Trump on Monday going to say, okay, we're going to open up the floodgates again and send all that stuff? Or is Europe going to fill in the gap? We do have some indication that Trump is going to be willing to sell weapons to NATO countries, that the NATO countries, specifically Germany, France, the UK, would then say, okay, we're going to send those weapons to Ukraine. So rather than seeing the U.S. do it directly, NATO countries would do it. The question is, can they get there fast enough? Because this air war we're seeing from Russia right now is just really punishing for Ukraine.
The special envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, set to arrive in Kyiv on Monday. He's going to spend the week there. Could this be finally the beginning of the end of this war?
The challenge there is that Vladimir Putin has shown no sign that he's willing to give up his principal aims, which are essentially he wants Volodymyr Zelensky out, and he wants de facto control over Ukraine. So if Vladimir Putin is undaunted, and you have countries like North Korea, as you guys are saying, continuing to supply more weapons to Russia, what incentive do they have to stop, especially right now when, by all accounts, they are actually in this very slow and grinding war, continuing to make slow but steady progress against Ukraine. So if Russia's not willing to give up, I think that's what you're going to see from the president on Monday, where he's really looking to try to force Putin to essentially start to give up. And unfortunately, though, we just haven't seen any sign that Putin's willing to get there.
But how would he force him to do that? I mean, I know you said maybe there will be additional sanctions. There could be the sanction bill that could actually get through. But apart from that, I guess what I'm saying is I'm skeptical of that working because none of this has worked over the last 3+ years.
Right. I mean, that's very true, and that's something that's on everybody's minds. But I think what you're seeing here is the president try to essentially do a sort of mental shift, as difficult as this would be for Vladimir Putin, where for the last 8 months since President Trump has been in power, the idea has been, okay, Trump is going to be a pushover. He's going to not restrain me in any way. If he does actually start to put up some resistance and really put pressure on Russia, does that change Vladimir Putin's calculus where he decides, okay, now I have to come to the negotiating table?
So during the Biden administration, of course, we did see a lot of fervent support for Ukraine, and especially when we think about resources being distributed. Yeah. Where are we now? How much has Trump essentially poured in? Is he putting the full force behind it as well?
Well, this is really what we're waiting to see. I mean, the big issue is that he seems to have overruled his defense secretary, who imposed this brief pause on sending air defense missiles to Ukraine. So then that really sent a shock through the system, because it was like, well, if it's not coming from the U.S., the Europeans are not in a position to be able to do that with any sort of reliable, long-term, sustained supply. We do now see that Trump has been willing to do that, but the big question again for Monday is, you know, they are running out of money. The U.S., the amount of money that Joe Biden had set aside to send these weapons to Ukraine is not limitless. It's starting to run out. Once that money really hits the bottom of the barrel, does President Trump decide, okay, we're going to re-up this now? Because Europe is just not going to be able to fill the gap with the kind of numbers that Ukraine needs.